People who ask me, what do you study, are partly confronting the challenge that Jason is describing, which is, I study governance, and I'm particularly interested in governance of the distributed network technologies that are the central focus of what we're studying today. And so how do I define governance? I define it as rule-based ordering of people and natural resources. What's one of the most important units of analysis if you're studying governance? Look across human societies across time, and it's organizations. Organizations are emergent and complex human social orders at a fundamental structural level. And so for me, my talk today is focused on organizations in historical perspective and what that sheds light on in terms of what Web3 is doing differently. And so to me, in order to understand what's different though, you got to understand what's the same. And so to me, a fundamental question that scholars of organizations from many different disciplines, from law, from economics, from political science have confronted is, why do we organize collectively? What is the ubiquity of organizational forms doing for societies? You've probably realized by now that I speak academese almost fluently. Indeed, I think in academese, and that's not a good thing socially. I'm not that much fun at cocktail parties, but I'll try to make things a little bit more vernacular because we have a public audience today. So why do we organize collectively? Well, Jason flourished to Ronald Coase, a Nobel laureate in economics, for his study of why do we see so many private firms if market processes are supposedly so efficient at allocating scarce resources? His answer was firms economize on the transaction costs of the market. Period. I've answered your questions. Probably not. Let me spell that out a little bit more clearly. We organize collectively because we're better together when we do so. The ubiquitous emergence of organizational forms and human social orders is proof that they're doing something really important. Subsequent scholars to Coase identified the fact, though, that the specific purpose of a particular collective action organization will determine the optimal structure for that organization. One simple example is massive firms in the United States economy, some of them organized as corporations the moment they had the chance to do so when laws changed to make corporate access general as opposed to a creature of the legislature. Yet other similarly complex and massive firms chose the partnership because corporations are more transparent. And they're checked and balanced with a board of directors that effectively constrains management to act on behalf of a much larger class of shareholders. That means corporations have a level of access to capital that partnerships could never command on open markets. But in contrast, that same set of benefits of the corporate form entails a set of trade-offs that are disadvantageous depending on what a group of people is organizing collectively to achieve. So in contrast, partnerships are more nimble. They can execute far more quickly than the relatively cumbersome governance structure that publicly traded corporations impose upon those organizations. And so there's also better aligned incentives within partnerships in terms of the owners actually being managers and a reduction in agency costs there too. So why that quick review of partnerships versus corporations? Because it emphasizes that the way in which we organize will determine how well we can achieve our collective objectives as a particular organization. This applies to people coordinating their activity on digital networks just as much as people coordinating their behavior via paper contracts. So what was the natural outgrowth of centralized firm hierarchies in the digital realm? Highly centralized databases and monolithic platforms capturing the lion's share of rents associated with that data collection, associated with that human activity being coordinated on a highly centralized database. But human progress's relentless dynamism means innovation springs eternal. Digital governance is no exception, especially if you understand institutions as a technology, as Jason emphasized. So, enter blockchains, a new innovation in how we organize ourselves collectively on digital networks to voluntarily coordinate our behavior. So blockchains have a role in facilitating distributed governance of voluntarily coordinated human activity. The lesson from the above the historical organizational perspective on choice of governance for a particular collective action organization, to me, the primal lesson is that what classes of human organization are these new network forms well suited to coordinating? And I'll get to that. I'll close on optimism. But those of you who have been at the workshops know that I'm a disagreeable sort. And so I do have a couple lessons from the study of human governance that suggest this stuff is always going to be hard. In a sense, governance is all about conflict. And so our distributed networks need to accommodate uncertainty and heterogeneous interests contained within them at a structural level. Despite the fact that when we organize collectively, we have an animating purpose that is very much unifying, that can lead organization designers to forget that they need to accommodate the conflict that will inevitably emerge within those organizations. And those who are interested in this stuff as a science, those of you who are attending a conference like this at opportunity cost of your own time, you're intrinsically motivated. To put it more bluntly, you think this stuff is cool. You see some level of potential that intrinsically interests you herein. There's a problem there, though. For these things to scale to a level to achieve their intended purposes, for them to coordinate tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of people on a particular network, they need to be resilient to the fact that many users, many participants on these networks are not as intrinsically interested and motivated as the members of this audience here. And so rational inattention is something that organization designers of distributed networks need to take very seriously. The reason that many people don't pay attention to politics that allow special interest groups to capture outcomes to an observable level in most democratic orders is a problem that private organizations have to confront, especially private organizations that want a level of membership participation. Problem is the early adopters are intrinsically motivated, but that may lead to an overabundance of optimism as to the extent to which that organization's institutions will be resilient to the inattention of many, many members. So those are my dismal lessons. Governance has to countenance the inevitability of conflict, and not everyone is going to be as intrinsically motivated to participate as audience members are here. So where is the cool? What's good about these things? To me, the emergent application of distributed networks to units of account native to a given network and more abstract financial derivatives built upon that, to me, those networks are already reliably processing complex transactions semi-autonomously. That's transformative. That's where the cool, to me, already is, and we already have clear proof of concept of those applications. But that's, to me, a digital asset layer that's not necessarily managed by a single monolithic platform. So the second example that I would reference is a future metaverse. Do you want that to look more like a supermarket or more like a farmer's market with thousands of artisanal producers who show up and allow their own individual creative agency to flourish? To me, a digital asset layer that is not managed by the monolithic platform that runs the metaverse, that preserves bargaining power in the hands of individual creators in a way that Facebook's metaverse never will. Do you want the App Store, or do you want something that looks a lot more like a farmer's market where individual digital creatives can credibly bargain as against counterparties? To me, the proof of concept that we already have in terms of these governance structures holds out the promise of an asset layer that's managed credibly by a third party that is not the one that provides the platform for the metaverse, and we'll see a lot more cool individual creative activity there too. A lot of this stuff also, though, is about data economies. How many of you feel like you're getting the fair share of your returns from your data provided to Instagram, Google, Facebook, you name the monolithic platform? I don't see many hands. You're getting services. I'm not saying you're getting nothing, but I'm part of a project that we're about to launch the world's first data trust that will be managed using this transparent technology and a set of stewards empowered to faithfully represent the interests of data providers within a complex financial ecosystem. And so for me, I'm like, we've already got credible management of reliably scarce digital units of account, and more abstract financial derivatives built on top of that. That suggests an asset layer that can be managed in a future metaverse that will coordinate far more than economic and financial activity in terms of human flourishing. And on top of that, we've got new models for managing data that are far more egalitarian and actually might result in far more exciting uses of that data. So that's my take on Web3 and historical organizational perspective. What's new? It's a transformative new technology. But what's the same? It's helping us organize collectively, because the emergence of organizational forms across human history is a direct testament to the fact that we're better together. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one more speaker in this session before you get a chance to ask questions. I'd like to introduce Morshed Manon from the European University Institute and part of the Blockchain Gov project, which is a European Research Council funded large-scale project. You'll be hearing from a few of them today.
I think I have some slides. Yeah, thanks. Is this on? Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. Okay, so I will be talking about a paper that I wrote recently about that constructs a case study of what is the first blockchain-based limited liability company named Diorg. Diorg, to put it very simply, is a software developers collective that builds Web3 products and in itself uses blockchain for managing its governance in part. So to give a bit of a context of why I would be even interested in this, I was interested in studying, remote high qualification labor. And here by remote, I mean that the workers are distant from headquarters, so to speak, from each other as well as from their clients. And individually, we know from the literature on the gig economy, platform work, and so on, that this sort of work entails many risks, from client non-repayment to having to pay certain insurances to dealing with, maintaining your own equipment, certain responsibilities in terms of tax and social security, and so on. So I was curious about these collective efforts in trying to both not only bargain, but also sort of coordinate these functions. Collectives enable pooling risks, but also give the opportunity for new solidaristic efforts, as Eric mentioned about imagining a different sort of future. But the question that arises is how to coordinate. Could I have the next slide? Yeah. So in contrast to typical, remote freelance work where there's a steady revenue stream and not being guaranteed, there is an absence of a community to learn from, and that there is subservience to what Eric called a monolithic platform, or what Wood and Ledenwirter have called recently as subservient autonomy. Diorg offers a workplace in which there is a high degree of operational autonomy and opportunities for collective decision-making. And so when new members join Diorg, for instance, they sign on to a contributor covenant that, among other things, requires demonstrating empathy and kindness towards other people. And this in itself intrigued me as what can this prefigure in terms of new sorts of DAOs? And they themselves saw that they would be a precursor for many other sorts of DAOs to come. And what I was particularly curious about, and that eventually led me to coin this term, corporate governance by design, was how do they deal with problems of trust emerging when you have pseudonymous actors trying to coordinate transnationally, and how do you deal with, for instance, the lack of a shared culture and so on, not to mention the many legal issues that arise. And over a couple of years, I did a lot of observation of what they are doing, and I interviewed some of their key leaders. I should mention that in the 42 months plus since its foundation, Diorg has generated over $5 million in on-chain revenue. So the DORG has implemented a type of collective governance where there is neither a board of directors nor professional management. Instead, numerous governance decisions are made directly by the members themselves through the use of blockchain-based systems, but also non-blockchain-based systems as well. According to the operating agreement of this BBLLC, this includes the admission and expulsion of members, the transfer of member units, so the unit of the LLC, work proposals for third parties and between work parties and DORG, upgrades or modifications to the DORG DAO and related software, as well as, of course, the operating agreement itself. Work is voted on, so whenever they agree to take on a new project, and they give only limited discretion to, for instance, a coordination lead or a quality assurance lead. And here it brings me to a point that I will get to the next slide, which is about earning reputation. So the way that they deal with the trust problem is by using what they call inflationary reputation. Earning reputation is not only about, signaling the quality of the work, as we know in the sort of context of the gig economy, or the level of commitment, or even bonus entitlements that members can enjoy, but more importantly, represents a proportional share of voting power and ownership within this collective. In DORG, 1 rep is earned by a member for every US dollar that is earned, as well as for certain activities that support the internal operations of DORG. So, for example, organizing in-person meetings and work referrals. Reputation is tied to units in the LLC, so it actually has a legal effect as well. It's not just tokens moving online. And the rep is also non-transferable and as such cannot be sold on secondary markets. This reputation is inflationary, which means that if you do not work and are inactive for a long period of time, your reputation tokens will become worth less compared to the others. A very sharp contrast to the sort of dual class, multi-class share structures we are familiar with. The governance, as I mentioned, is partly on-chain and partly off-chain. So for instance, now they use Snapshot rather than Alchemy. So the part that is on-chain is for the fact that they have a DORG token. They have 102 token holders here. You can see that there are certain more important players, but it's still quite small. And some of the founders have almost no reputation anymore because they're no longer involved, which is quite interesting that this happened almost naturally by plan. In effect, reputation scores are a weak proxy for like the many metrics that we can think of to assess the trustworthiness of another individual. And just like how reputation was used to coordinate amongst strangers in the past, this is the sort of basis for coordinating amongst pseudonymous workers here. Which is very, without the benefit of strong and effective law enforcement, it is the threat of diminished reputation that also orders behavior in this case. So I won't go into a lot of detail about this. I have much more in the paper about different categories of authority, and I try to contrast, let's say, the bureaucratic organization like the public limited liability company to the ideal collectivist democratic organization and place DORG somewhere in between. They have certain features that they share with both, I would argue, the bureaucratic organization and the collectivist democratic one. So for instance, they have maximal rules while collectivist democratic ones don't, but on the other hand, they have a more of a communitarian ethos than the typical bureaucratic organization. Happy to answer questions about this later. But this brings me to my main point, which is about they are trying to achieve essentially what I call corporate governance by design by seeking to preempt agency problems through the ex-ante use of mechanisms provided in their techno-legal governance assemblage. So the combination of all of these various tools they use with their operating agreement. So I'll give you a couple of examples. If you think of the vertical agency problem that exists between principal and agents, so between a manager and the shareholders, or the board of directors and shareholders, you can have the issue that you do not know if that agent is going to act in your best interest or not. Here, the way they try to deal with this is by just reducing the possibility of doing any sort of delegation, and the delegation they do is very, very precise and limited. And that is a way of trying to, mitigate the problem of having agents altogether. You also have this issue of horizontal agency problem, so between members, and the problem of trusting members, between themselves. And so you have this issue where you have senior members and junior members. This arose with, for instance, in the case study that I did, in terms of getting work. older members were not happy with a lot of work being brought on. Some of it was not high quality, and this led to a conflict between the members themselves. And the use of inflationary reputation is interesting there, because that can be a way through which both new, let's say, upstart members can be controlled, but also senior members who are blocking the progress of the collective can also experience a deflation of their influence over the governance. So inflationary reputation and disclosures are key. So finally, when we talk about the pros and cons of corporate governance by design, we can see that, focusing on disclosures and, having this very deliberative democratic process in a way can lead to, reducing information asymmetries through transparency, and can enable the coordination of work and governance transnationally in the absence of interpersonal trust. But the cons of this are also many. So to draw from the workshop we've been having, transparency doesn't necessarily lead to accountability. So we started to see in just by observing how governance is being practiced is reduced personal autonomy and moral responsibility over decisions, because you still end up having even those who might, with this inflationary reputation characteristics, some being more active in governance than others. It reduces intrinsic motivations to participate, and very related to Eric's point, I think this focus on voting and mediation and these sorts of mechanisms often leaves little room for the role of a neutral third-party actor that can enforce certain rules and have a very important ex post role in the governance of these systems. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Okay, does anyone else want to open with the first question? Or is this, yeah, we have one right in the middle here.
Working.
Feel free to say who you are, everyone in the audience.
Just simply like.
Oh, sorry, you need to use the mic. Can we give him the other mic? Just because this is being recorded.
That was working. Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay, great. So just usually these structures, like whether people is around a constitution, a nation, and so on, have to have, apparently, with main Western theory, an hegemon. So can the hegemon be eliminated in this sort of structure that we're talking about, this decentralized one?
Oh, you can hear us.
So, I mean, I take your question to be that constitutions and formally defined organizations, especially hierarchical ones, are sort of consonant with a Western hegemony in institutional design or even thought about how we organize collectively. Is that a correct way to frame your question? To what extent can we ever eliminate hierarchy altogether within organizations? To me, I think it's natural that you want some measure of concentration of influence. Whether or not that corresponds to rigid hierarchy is a deep question, and I think there are components of Web3 governance whose transparency will restrain concentrated influence. But two examples I want to give is, the protocol updates for these networks require a high degree of technical sophistication to even begin to understand how to generate them. And so maybe the discourse in a community does necessarily involve many voices about how to proceed, but when it comes to operationalizing how to proceed, a subset are ones who possess the technical sophistication to actually operationalize those changes. Another example I would give is the data trust I referenced, which is there's a role for collective bargaining. Those who think unions play an important role in restraining the power of private corporations, they like centralization of authority, because it's centralizing authority within the union that overcomes the collective action problem that individuals, workers face as against bargaining with the powerful monolithic corporation. And so for me, those are both examples of concentration of influence within our human organizations that are not intrinsically bad. although it does lead to problems of capture, which is any time you have concentration of influence. And so for me, I'm skeptical as to the extent within which complex human organizations we will ever see the eradication of concentration of influence. But what's cool about this technology is a lot of the transparency and verifiability components that I think check the darker ways in which concentration of influence can bleed into special interest capture directly.
If I'll just add briefly to that with two examples from this research I was doing for this chapter. You have the example of how work was referred to this particular DAO, where in the beginning they wanted to first accept all members, all work. And this sort of, let's say, open, non-hierarchical way of trying to, and permissionless way of trying to deal with this led to many problems. One of which was that you ended up having too many projects being referred to, so it led to a problem of overcapacity. And so the way they ended up having to deal with it was collectively deciding that we are going to create both more barriers for work referral, as well as, so by disincentivizing how much work is being referred because they would get referral fees. And the other is by doing this very targeted delegation of authority to certain types of leads, as they call them. And I think this is very interesting because you can say that this is a type of hierarchicization that a collective is doing, especially when the collective has, at the beginning, given itself a lot of authority to do things directly. But over time, experience leads them to think that, okay, we can actually be more efficient by thinking about hierarchy in certain ways, and then also tinkering with where do I introduce hierarchy and where do I not.
Thank you. We have two more questions and then we'll move into the next session. First down here and then up.
Thank you. I'm Jason. I just want to say, firstly, it was fantastic to hear. Well, there's often a latency with folks speaking about blockchain, but it's evident that you have a participatory knowledge, like you actually use it. There's like a degen element to all of you, which I think is really refreshing in terms of how it informs your perspective. I'm just curious if you have any sense of how Web3 and the kind of exponential rise of artificial intelligence will collide. It seems that the stable diffusion guy was recently saying about how he was excited about Web3, but they don't have much AI built into it. And now he's going off to kind of trying to get nation states on board with AI, and then you've got Apple and so on. And I just wonder, like, what do you sense might emerge in the conflict between decentralized Web3 and AI?
I'm sure Jason has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have opinions. Convergence, I think, is what we're going to see on a massive scale. These are the way that we've been thinking about this is the significance of blockchain as it's the base layer administrative record keeping thing that just gets all of the facts straight. That was the common knowledge argument, which means that you've got a digital foundation. Like this, and that's the big shift that we're going through from the last few thousand years, where the foundation of the administrative state in terms of the hegemon, or the banking system or the payment system or the whatever was analog. It was written on paper. It was writing. Writing was the first great technology of centralization that enabled us to scale up societies by having written records of things. But what we're going through now is this transition to digital writing, where we're now keeping all of these fundamental social truths about intersubjective facts, identity, ownership, control, social, contracting, natively digital. Upon that, everything else, all of the other digital technologies will then assemble and build into that stack. And it'll be messy, and there'll be lots of bits will come in. But I think, I individually, I think a number of us have fundamentally revised our blockchain decentralized, AI centralized narrative, which now feels just wrong. And it might have been because we were seeing that the main drivers of AI research were very much sort of a surveillance state was driving it as a control, and I'm not going to say the country, but you know which country I'm talking about, was sort of driving that. But the enormous explosion of what we've seen with Midjourney and OpenAI and all of that stuff has suddenly put what felt like it was converging into a naturally centralized hegemonic surveillance technology of an all-powerful state, suddenly is now on everyone's laptops. We like this year, we massively decentralized that technology, took that power out, gave it to everyone, released it into the wild. It's not coming back again. Didn't see that coming. Amazing, because now it can join all the other decentralized digital stack technologies. So convergence is the answer here, but convergence in a really hopeful, powerful, distributed, infrastructural technology for the people wherever they are, so long as they have access to the internet and computation.
If I might just briefly add, I think a specific application that I'm excited about is blockchain analytics aren't easy, and therefore they're rife with incentives for market manipulation, high-frequency trading, front-running, you name the set of problems. To me, AI tools should be able to detect that type of behavior far better than most humans are capable of doing. In a more general sense, golly, is AI going to disrupt a lot of things? But to me, disruption is opportunity. And so, to me, a lot of the pace of disruption increasing is an opportunity for many of these new organizational forms and technologies to take hold ever more rapidly.
So I know there's more questions, but arms race is what we're now into now. We're now into the race where it's just everyone can get in and involved and just go as fast as possible. Like this is going to be convergence plus acceleration.
I feel like there's an arms race between speakers right now. And that's
I'll defer my question until the next session.
You
I have
sure?
a question
Okay.
about motivation. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And, but to keep us on schedule, I'll just wait. It's not an urgent question now.
Brilliant. Well, let's thank our first panel of speakers, Jason, Morshed, and Eric.